Right. Okay. It's Mike here. I'm going to kick off and then hand over to Bert. So firstly, just the introduction and context for our work. So carbon dioxide removal at scale is widely viewed as essential to meeting our global climate targets. The sector, CDR sector, is quite small, but demand is exploding. So we need to scale supply fast, and we need to ensure that we retain quality and credibility. We think the sector will scale sustainably only if providers' claims are trusted. If we get rapid growth that leads to a few bad actors or some bad projects and those gain notoriety, we fear that could undermine the whole sector. So we're going to propose, and we'll detail it a little bit here, a blockchain-enabled ecosystem to establish a chain of trust that results in trust scores being published for CDR actors and projects. We think blockchain brings a few things to the table here. CDR needs to happen at planetary scale. CDR trust will draw on many diverse actors with no single central authority. So that need for decentralized trust at scale matches well with some core design principles of blockchains. A blockchain can robustly store and publish a full audit trail of all inputs and outputs of this trust score mechanism. And we could see a few potential consumers, for example, of the trust scores. You could have trusted receipts for CDR achieved by a project that would be delivered to the buyer to prove a claim of carbon neutrality. You could have a trusted metric that would guide buyers to high quality CDR projects. And you could have, we could imagine that CDR activity could coalesce to being traded on exchanges of some type. And we know NASDAQ's recent purchase of a majority stake in Puro, and also Sylvia Terra rebranding itself as the Natural Capital Exchange, at which point the trust score could become a listing requirement on those exchanges in the same way that company accounts with auditor sign-offs are required for a stock market listing, for example. I'll hand over to Bert, who's going to walk us through the design, and I'll turn the slides, Bert.
All right. Can you guys hear me?
I can.
Yep. Okay, so I'll just talk quickly about these sort of elements of this ecosystem that Mike has sort of set the stage for. So when we think of this ecosystem, we think of 5 main components. So first are the actors themselves. Now we can break this down into, say, 2 groups. So this is an actual carbon dioxide removal provider. So say one of the many projects or sort of project types that we've been presented early on today. Or maybe observers of these projects, or companies, individuals, agencies that evaluate them. So establishing this chain of trust. The next component is what we would call the identity registry. So this establishes first a provenance for the provider of the CDR, but also identities for evaluators in the community. So we can think of this as, you know, a physical identity document that's been digitalized. Blockchain represents a potential innovation in the tech space for issuing these so-called decentralized identifiers or digital identifiers. The third component of this ecosystem would be the documents. So this includes the expected value that a CDR project would provide, the receipt associated with it, but also an opinion. So an opinion from third parties about what the CDR provider is giving. So we could consider this, say, an a priori in the evaluation of a project. The next component in the documents are the actual observations that people compare against the expectation from the provider. Now, all of these observations, expected values, opinions feed into trust contracts. So this is, again, where blockchain plays an important role in the system. Essentially, this is an immutable storage of inputs, so the opinions and observations, and outputs. These aggregate observations or scores that are assigned both to projects, but also the people evaluating those projects. Now, the fifth element This is what we would call off-chain, not something that's executed on blockchain for various different reasons. We won't go into technical details now, but since blockchain is distributed across many players, it's very energy intensive to use. This is an off-chain process that takes the inputs and can iteratively process information. Our colleague will, Ari will explain this process to you in a little bit. Go to the next slide, Mike. So if we want to tie things together, this is a schematic that we came up with during the 3 weeks to just kind of explain how the ecosystem works. So we have on the right side of the screen, basically the actors we were talking about, the project, their expected output, their opinions and observations from evaluators. These are fed into, in step A, these inputs recorded on a blockchain as a mutable record of, what's being done in the ecosystem, either what's being presented or observed or opinionated on. Then we have the information, these inputs that are fed into a scoring engine off-chain. Essentially what this does is establish an aggregate score for a CDR project. These are then fed as outputs that can be recorded on-chain. Now, where a revised score for this CDR project is output, and generates trust scores, both for the project itself, but also the opinions and observations of the actors in this CDR ecosystem. So now that we have an overview of the general ecosystem, we'll dive into a more specific use case by our colleague Ari. So if you want to move to the next slide, and Ari, you can jump in.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So we designed here a little scenario to explain what we meant by providing a trust score to different actors. We took the scenario of I invented a little company called Tree Planters. Their job is to plant tree and remove carbon. So basically, we have a tree planter C who will generate a receipt for removing X ton of carbon by planting Y number of trees. We have a second actor who is more an evaluator, but maybe a scientist or someone that wants to provide a priori evaluation of the technique. He might be saying something like, we don't agree with your methodology. We don't think you're using the correct trees because it will absorb the correct amount of carbon, or any criticism. He can provide an opinion about the tree planters methodology. And then we have a third kind of actor who is more an evaluator, someone who will use actual data to provide actual compared to the receipts generated by the tree planters. So you have here the two kind of evaluation, the a priori one based on simply an opinion, and you have the forest auditor based on actual data that was collected during an evaluation audit. So, for example, to start, before that the audit arrived, so before that we compare the data to the actual receipt, the floor scientist can provide an opinion on the methodology of tree planters. And as anybody, all the actors are submitted to a trust score themselves. So for example, if floor scientist is trusted into the community, his opinion will actively prop up or prop down the trust score of tree planters according of his evaluation. If he's unknown to the scene, his opinion won't do much to prop up or prop down the score of tree planters. And if he's distrusted, we might take the opposite of his opinion to prop up or prop down the score of tree planters. Now, if an actual audit is executed and we have actual data that is provided to evaluate the receipt, at this point, we can retrocalculate all the scores, the trust score that was provided before in a previous scenario. So, for example, the forest auditor calculated the amount of carbon that was removed. He thinks tree planter gained trust if it exceeded the expectation. The calculations say he did a good job, so everybody's happy. There is a good score for tree planters. Or in the opposite, the score is not good, it's way under the expectations. So the tree planters lose the trust further after that. But we didn't forget about flora scientists. Flora scientists provide an opinion before the audit. And his opinion needs to be evaluated too, because maybe he said, your technique was wrong, it will never work, and actually it worked. So his opinion deserves a bad score. And it works also in the other way around. He provided a good evaluation before the data, and the data support his evaluation, then his trust score should be propped up. So here's a little example of what we were thinking about. And all this can be done by the calculator engine, who will just take the trust score from before, the data that he can compare to the receipt, and recalculate and propagate this trust to every actor that was involved in the operation. Voila.
I guess we can move to the next slide, Mike, and I guess we can close up the presentation. Yeah, so we've talked about this trust propagation ecosystem, essentially an iterative process. One could also present this sort of an analogy to a machine learning algorithm of these trust scores. And we use the blockchain in an initial step just to store information both about the people in the ecosystem, their identities, but also what they're reporting and the trust assigned to them. And this information can then be sort of used in future evaluation or future scoring. So through this sort of iterative process that one would use in, say, a machine learning algorithm. Now, if we go back to how this could be applied, we can think of 3 different levels. So first, there's if you think of an offset market or an offset scheme, you have the project, a CO2 registry, and the buyer. So at the first level, we have a sort of provenance system for establishing trust for the actors, projects, and the reviewers. At the registry level, so this is where you say have an offset exchange or an offset market, for example, like NASDAQ is setting up with different partners. So you can actually use the system to establish application criteria or applicant criteria for people registering in these offset registries. And at the final level, you have the buyer. So you can use the blockchain to have these immutable receipts of CDR purchases, but now they come with this dynamic trust score. So you can see over time, how does your project stack up with its expected CDR provisions? So yeah. That's where we sort of saw or foresee blockchain fitting into this ecosystem. Obviously, there are several other applications, and we interesting to see what the other team came up with.